In the late 1800s, one man sent shockwaves through history, his crimes terrifying the world: Jack the Ripper. But what if his legacy didn't end in 1888? Over the next 120 years, a chilling pattern emerged: copycat killers who were obsessed with the Ripper's brutal legacy. From the dark alleys of Victorian London to the streets of today, we'll uncover the twisted link between the world's most infamous serial killer and those who followed in his footsteps. So a copycat killer is where a murderer was modelled, motivated and/or inspired by either a real-life murderer that has been reported by print or broadcast media, or based on a murderer portrayed in books, film or television. The murders themselves are committed as established by a previous murder committed by another person. On the morning of the 22nd of September 1888, the body of 26-year-old Jane Beadmore was found in the small mining town of Birtley near Gateshead, County Durham. The day before her murder, she had visited friends at a house nearby until 7 in the evening. And then she went to the Mountmore public house where she drank a bottle of lemonade, and then to the shop where she bought some sweets. She was last seen around 8:30 walking along a public road in the opposite direction to her home. She was found the following day by a man named John Fish on his way to work around 7 a.m. She was lying in a ditch just off the road she had last been seen walking along. A medical examination noted wounds on her face and neck. Her spinal cord had been completely severed. Her abdomen had been cut open in an upward motion, and these wounds had been inflicted with a knife. The similarity to the Whitechapel murder victims were not lost on the police, and Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who had performed the post-mortem on Annie Chapman a few weeks earlier, was sent to examine the body. However, in Jane's case, the cause of death was a deep wound to her left cheek, and the police didn't have to look far for a suspect. Most people in the area believed that she had been killed by William Waddell, a former sweetheart who had been snubbed by Jane after she had met another man, and who had not been seen since Jane's body had been found. A description of Waddell was circulated and published in several newspapers, and Waddell was seen on Yett home on the 1st of October 1888 and arrested. Initially, he denied knowing Jane, but admitted that he'd left her dead on the 22nd of September 1888. He was tried for a murder on the 29th of November 1888, and the jury took only 30 minutes to find him guilty. The judge imposed a sentence of death by hanging, which was carried out at just after 8 a.m. on the 18th of December 1888. Shortly before his death, Waddell confessed to the murder to a dean who had visited him in prison. He said that he'd been so drunk he'd lost his mind, and that he had been reading the accounts of the Whitechapel murders in the newspaper, and his mind must have been deranged. At the time, it was easy for copycat killers. The newspapers reported very detailed accounts of the injuries inflicted on the victims, taken directly from the testimony given at the inquests. Indeed, the only records we have about the inquests come from the newspapers. But Jack the Ripper's legacy didn't end in 1888. In fact, 76 years later, another killer emerged in London. The chilling Hammersmith nude murders were committed in 1964 and 1965, when 6 women, each stripped almost completely naked, were found dead, either in or near the River Thames in West London. Soon after the crimes began, the newspapers gave the perpetrator the nickname Jack the Stripper, an obvious play on Jack the Ripper. 30-year-old Hannah Tailford was found on the 2nd of February 1964. 25-year-old Irene Lockwood, who was pregnant, was found on the 7th of April 1964. 22-year-old Helen Barthélemy was found on the 24th of April 1964. 39-year-old Mary Fleming was found on the 14th of July 1964. 21-year-old Frances Brown was found on the 25th of November 1964. And 27-year-old Bridget O'Hara was found on the 16th of February 1965. It's also believed that 21-year-old Elizabeth Figg was found strangled on the 17th of June 1959, and 22-year-old Gwyneth Rees, found on the 8th of November 1963, were also victims. Most of the women had died from asphyxiation, with missing teeth, likely removed by the killer, and all had been stripped almost completely naked. Chief Superintendent John DeRose of Scotland Yard was in charge of the investigation. In spring 1965, he held a news conference falsely announcing that the police had narrowed the suspect pool down to 20 men, and that by process of elimination, these suspects were being eliminated from the investigation. After a short time, he announced that the suspect pool contained only 10 members, and then 3. There were no further murders. The case remains unsolved, but forensic evidence was gathered at the time of the murders. However, it's believed to have been lost. So why is he considered to be a copycat? Well, the killer was never identified, so we couldn't possibly know what his motivations were, whether he intended to imitate Jack the Ripper. There were certainly some similarities though, which may be why the press came up with the name Jack the Stripper. Obviously, like Jack the Ripper, he was an unknown killer. He preyed on prostitutes and made no attempts to dispose of the bodies. The women were all strangled, as were the canonical 5, though the throats were not cut. As with Jack the Ripper, there was an eyewitness description from a woman who saw Frances Brown getting into a car with a man shortly before she died, and an identikit was prepared. The victims were all found in London, however in the west rather than the east. And like Jack the Ripper, the murders suddenly stopped, perhaps because he thought that after the police press conference he would be found. Jack the Ripper undoubtedly felt the pressure as a result of 2 police forces and the Vigilance Committee. There were several suspects and theories about the identity of the killer, and these still continue. Kenneth Archibald confessed to killing Irene Lockwood, only to recount his confession when he went to trial. As there was no other evidence tying him to the murders, he was found not guilty. Mungo Island, a security guard at the Heron Trading Estate where Bridget O'Hara was found, and also the source of paint found on Helen Bartholomew and Mary Fleming. He took his own life after being linked to the murders. Another suspect was British light heavyweight boxing champion Freddie Mills. It was apparently common knowledge in the West End of London in certain circles that Mills was the murderer, and he also took his own life. An unknown retired Metropolitan Police detective was apparently suspected by several senior detectives to have been the murderer. Tommy Butler, superintendent of Metropolitan Police's flying squad, an elite squad who deal with violent crime, Butler was put forward in 2002. Harold Jones, a convicted murderer who had killed 2 girls in 1921 at the age of 15 and had been released at the age of 35 in 1941 for good behaviour. These crimes were similar to the Hammersmith nude murders, though he wasn't considered a suspect at the time. Finally, Jack the Ripper was linked to scandal involving the royals, and these murders were linked to a government scandal. Hannah Tailford and Frances Brown were connected to the Profumo affair. For any of you who don't know, John Profumo was appointed as the Secretary of State for War in 1960. There was a scandal when it was learned that 46-year-old Profumo had had an extramarital affair with 19-year-old model Christine Keeler. There were claims of prostitution and spying, and it's believed that some of the victims were a part of an underground party scene appearing in pornographic films, and many think that the victims likely knew one another, and the killer also had connections to this underground scene. Fast forward to the 1970s, and the fear in the Yorkshire area was palpable. Women were again being targeted in brutal attacks. Peter Sutcliffe would eventually be identified as the Yorkshire Ripper. Sutcliffe, however, took it to a new, more public level with his infamous series of attacks on women across northern England. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946, and at the time he was married and employed as a lorry driver. He murdered at least 13 women and attempted to murder 7 others between 1975 and 1980 in Preston, Manchester and West Yorkshire, leaving 23 children without mothers. Sutcliffe's first known attack was in 1969 when he hit a prostitute over the head with a stone in a sock. The police were involved, however, the woman didn't want to press charges. In July and August 1975, Sutcliffe attacked 3 women: 36-year-old Anna Rogulski on the 5th of July, 46-year-old Olive Smelt on the 15th of August, and 14-year-old Tracy Brown on the 27th of August. He was interrupted during all 3 attacks, and all 3 women survived. His first known murder was on the 30th of October 1975, when he killed 28-year-old Wilma McCann. He killed 42-year-old Emily Jackson on the 20th of January 1976. He attacked 20-year-old Marcella Claxton on the 9th of May 1976. She was 4 months pregnant and suffered a miscarriage as a result of the attack. In 1977, Sutcliffe murdered 28-year-old Irene Richardson. On the 5th of February, 32-year-old Patricia Atkinson Mitra and 16-year-old Jane MacDonald on the 25th of June. On the 10th of July 1977, Sutcliffe attacked 43-year-old Maureen Long, who survived but was hospitalised for 9 weeks. On the 1st of October, he killed 20-year-old Jean Jordan. He attacked 25-year-old Marilyn Moore on the 14th of December. She escaped, but with serious head injuries. In 1978, Sutcliffe killed 21-year-old Yvonne Ann Pearson on the 21st of January, 18-year-old Elena Ritka on the 31st of January, and 40-year-old Vera Millward on the 16th of May. On the 2nd of March 1979, Sutcliffe attacked 22-year-old Anne Rooney. She survived and was able to give a description of Sutcliffe and his car. He killed 19-year-old Josephine Whittaker on the 4th of April 1979 and 20-year-old Barbara Leach on the 1st of September. On the 20th of August 1980, he murdered 47-year-old Marguerite Walls and 34-year-old Padya Bandara on the 24th of September. He attacked 21-year-old Maureen Lee on the 25th of October. She survived, as did 16-year-old Teresa Sykes on the 5th of November, whose screams alerted her boyfriend, who came out, causing Sutcliffe to flee. He murdered 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill on the 17th of November 1980. So he'd crept up on some of the women. Some had gone with him after he'd offered them a lift when it was late at night on the way home, and Sutcliffe attacked all of the women from behind and hit them in the head using a hammer. He cut and stabbed most with knives and screwdrivers. On the 2nd of January 1981, whilst in the company of 24-year-old Olivia Reaver, Sutcliffe was arrested for driving with fake registration plates on his car. He was questioned about the murders. The following day, Sergeant Robert Ring had a hunch and decided to return to the scene of the arrest. There he found a knife, a hammer and a rope. Sutcliffe had hid these during the arrest when he had told the police he had needed to use the bathroom. He'd also hidden another knife in the toilet cistern at the police station when he'd been allowed to use the toilet there. A search warrant was obtained for his house, and 2 days later he confessed. Despite his confession though, he thought he was smarter than the police and tried to get out of it. He told them that he'd killed the women because God had told him to kill prostitutes. He was later overheard telling his wife that if he could get them to believe that he was mentally ill, he would only get 10 years in the, quote, loony bin. He pleaded guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His claim was rejected by the trial judge, Sir Leslie Boreham, who insisted on a jury trial, and this began in May 1981. After 2 weeks, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences. The court later ruled that Sutcliffe would never be released, and thankfully he wasn't. Peter Sutcliffe died at the age of 74 in 2020 from COVID-19 and diabetes-related complications. So why is Peter Sutcliffe considered a copycat? Well, like Jack the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper probably had more victims than were identified. Sutcliffe attacked prostitutes, but not exclusively, and like Jack the Ripper, Sutcliffe's attacks on the women were brutal, overkill, much more than was necessary to kill them, though the initial attack seems to have been part of the overall enjoyment for Sutcliffe, with no obvious increased injuries. Both attacked the lower abdomen of the victims, and there's evidence that both killers were interrupted during their attacks. Both left the victims where they would easily be found, with no real effort to hide them. And like the Metropolitan Police at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, the West Yorkshire Police were heavily criticised for not arresting Sutcliffe earlier, especially when it came out that they had interviewed him 9 times during their investigation. And going back to the FBI profile that was done in 1988, this stated that it would be likely that the police had also interviewed Jack the Ripper, but had let him go. During the Jack the Ripper murders, many believed that Jack the Ripper was a foreigner. There were also numerous hoax letters claiming to have been from the murderer. During the Yorkshire Ripper murders, it was believed that the murderer was a Georgie because of hoax confessions on tape that were sent to the police from a man with a Geordie accent.
You are no nearer catching me now. And 4 years ago when I started.
And I do wonder if, because the tapes were received and made public, the women weren't afraid to go with Sutcliffe because he didn't have that distinctive Geordie accent. And if Jack the Ripper wasn't a foreigner, that gave his victims a similar false sense of security if he was English. Richard Ramirez. Born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on the 29th of February 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez was also known as the Night Stalker, the Walk-In Killer, and the Valley Intruder. Renowned American psychiatrist Michael Stone stated that Ramirez was a made rather than a born psychopath. His father was an alcoholic, and he was abusive towards Ramirez, who was knocked unconscious and almost killed on several occasions before the age of 6. And this caused him to develop temporal lobe epilepsy, aggressivity, and temporal lobe hypersexuality. He was also heavily influenced by an older cousin, Mike, a Vietnam veteran who killed his wife in front of Richard Ramirez when he was 15. And Ramirez also developed an interest in the occult. As a teenager, he worked in a local hotel where he had 2 children, though he was never investigated for this. He lost his job when he attempted to rape a woman who was staying there as a guest, though he was interrupted by a husband who beat him violently, and no charges were brought against him. He left Texas for California at the age of 22, developing an addiction to cocaine, and to fund this habit, he began robbing homes, soon adding murder, attempted murder, rape, and battery. Ramirez used various methods of killing his victims, and some he even decided not to kill. On the 28th of June 1984, Ramirez killed 79-year-old Jenny Vincow. On the 17th of March 1985, he shot 22-year-old Maria Hernandez. She survived, but her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, was shot dead. Less than an hour later, he killed Sally Ann Yu. On the 27th of March 1985, he killed 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his 44-year-old wife Maxine. On the 14th of May 1985, he killed 66-year-old Bill Doy and assaulted his 56-year-old wife Lillian. On the 29th of May 1985, he assaulted 83-year-old Mabel Bell and her 81-year-old sister Florence Lang. Both later died in the hospital. On the 30th of May 1985, he assaulted 42-year-old Carol Kyle. She survived the attack. On the 2nd of July 1985, he killed 75-year-old Mary Cannon. On the 5th of July 1985, he assaulted 16-year-old Whitney Bennett. He attempted to strangle her with a telephone cord, but when sparks came from it, he abandoned the attack, believing that Jesus had intervened. On the 7th of July, Ramirez burglarised 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson. He then broke into the home of 63-year-old Sophie Dickman, who he assaulted and handcuffed and robbed at gunpoint. On the 20th of July, Ramirez killed 66-year-old Layla and 68-year-old Maxon Needing. He then killed 32-year-old Chanarong Covenant and assaulted his 32-year-old wife Somkid. On the 6th of August 1985, he attacked 30-year-old Chris and 27-year-old Virginia Peterson. The couple both survived their injuries. On the 8th of August 1985, he killed 27-year-old Alias Abawath and then assaulted his 27-year-old wife. On the 18th of August 1985, he killed Peter Pan, 66, and his wife Barbara. On the 24th of August 1985, he was seen trying to break into the house of 45-year-old James Romero by his son, James Romero III, who got details of the car and a registration number. The same night, he attacked 30-year-old Bill Cairns and his 29-year-old fiancée, Inez Erickson. Both survived. Ramirez abandoned the car identified by Romero, which was found by the police, and they lifted a fingerprint, which led to his identification. A photograph was circulated. And on the 30th of August 1985, Ramirez was identified and chased down by members of the public. He was beaten and restrained until the police arrived, and it's said that if the police hadn't arrived sooner, they probably would have killed him. At his trial, he drew a pentagram on his hand, raised it, and said, "Hail Satan." On the 20th of September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. On the 7th of November 1989, he was sentenced to death. Responding to the death sentence, Ramirez said to reporters, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." In 2009, Ramirez was linked to the murder of 9-year-old May Leung, who died on the 10th of April 1984 after his DNA matched a sample taken from the scene of the murder. Ramirez died on the 7th of June 2013 as a result of complications related to lymphoma. His body wasn't claimed. So why was he a copycat? Well, he's quoted as saying that he admired Jack the Ripper after reading about the murders when he was younger. He apparently also said that Jack the Ripper had inspired him to commit his crimes. However, I'm not convinced. His actions and claims seem to me to have been belligerent, as though he was purposely trying to make people feel uncomfortable. For example, the "Hail Satan" comment in court. It was out of context for what was going on. And in my opinion, you can't get much more uncomfortable than a man who claims his hero was Jack the Ripper. Like Jack the Ripper, he was undoubtedly a violent man. His attacks on his victims were just brutal. His spree of crimes for which he was ultimately caught and tried, like the Ripper, were committed over a relatively short period of time. He didn't attack prostitutes, he attacked both males and females of varying ages, from children to the elderly. He assaulted many of his victims, however, it's understood that Jack the Ripper didn't. The main reason that I think his Jack the Ripper claims were made just to shock is that other than his initial crimes in Texas, the initial house break-ins were financially motivated, and there were no murders initially. These came later, almost as a secondary motive. Though it could be argued that there was a practical motive for this, so there were no witnesses. What he did afterwards, the mutilation, the pentagrams drawn on the walls, etc., came afterwards and were not present in all murders. In that way, he was trying to copy Jack the Ripper, to be shocking, to leave a shocking crime scene, though he didn't kill all of those he attacked and assaulted. Was it a need for notoriety or something darker? Derek Brown was born in 1960 in Preston, in the northwest of England. In 1994, he moved to South London after serving a 7-year sentence for rape and burglary, and worked as a newspaper delivery driver. 29-year-old Xiao Mei Go was a Chinese immigrant who sold counterfeit DVDs on Whitechapel Market. She went missing in August 2007, and her disappearance was soon reported to the police. Police began an investigation who found CCTV footage of Xiao Mei talking to 47-year-old Brown at the Whitechapel Underground station before the two headed to the Tube. Around that time, she had sent a text message to a friend saying that she was going to a customer's home so he could test some DVDs he was going to buy, and it's believed that that customer was Brown. 22-year-old Bonnie Barrett had been working the streets for several years to fund a drug addiction. She disappeared on the 18th of September 2007. Several of her colleagues who were interviewed after her disappearance knew Brown as a customer, and they had been to his flat. Bonnie also knew Brown, who had been a client on several occasions before this. Police searched for Brown, showing his photograph around the area, and on the 6th of October 2007, he was arrested when he was spotted in a local Londish shop. 2 days later, Brown's flat was searched. On the surface, it looked clean, but it looked too clean. Under fluorescent lights, almost every surface contained blood, which when tested was found to belong to Xiao Mei and to Bonnie. Brown had tried to clean the evidence. He had removed the carpet and furniture and was in the process of repainting the entire flat. Police also found receipts from a B&Q DIY store where he had bought various items clearly intended to use to dismember and dispose of a body and then clean up afterwards. A search was mounted to locate the bodies in the surrounding area, along with divers in the Thames. Railway lines were also searched. However, the search turned up nothing. It's suspected that he threw body parts into the Thames or through an industrial crusher where he worked. Brown was tried the following year and sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. He's reportedly shown no remorse for his crimes, yawning following the verdict when the judge addressed him for the crimes, and giving no reaction when his sentence was passed. After the trial, the police revealed that Brown had previously been convicted for several rapes. They're also currently investigating other cases of missing women that he may have been involved in. The remains of Bonnie and Jean May have never been found, and despite several appeals to Brown, he has refused to confess to where they are. Derek Brown was obsessed with serial killers, and he wanted to mimic Jack the Ripper in particular. Library records showed that he had borrowed Nigel Cawthorne's Killers, the most barbaric murderers of our time, from his local library before committing the murders, studying murders such as Dennis Nielsen and Peter Sutcliffe. He'd selected Whitechapel to find his victims to emulate Jack the Ripper. He lived in Rotherhithe, but searched for his victims in Whitechapel, 2 miles away. Brown craved notoriety and bragged to friends that he was going to be famous and that they would soon be hounded by the press for information about him. Apart from his brutality, there aren't many similarities between he and Jack the Ripper. He preyed on women and he was brutal. But the fact is, at least in my opinion, he was just a bit pathetic. There was no mystery to him, nothing to analyse and wonder about. He just wanted to be famous, and the only way to do this was to take the lives of at least 2 women. And he was so pathetic that even then, he had to copy someone else, ride on their coattails. And I hope he's never released from prison. In the next video, we'll explore the recently resurfaced claims that DNA has solved the Jack the Ripper case. Is the evidence as convincing as it sounds, or is it too good to be true? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.